Okay, welcome everyone. So for today's presentation, we have Gordana Marmulla. She is from the Social Network Lab. We see a lot of her members, her colleagues actually, in the video cam. So welcome everyone. And Gordana is a final year PhD student supervised by Ulrik Brandes at the Social Network Lab of ETH Zurich. Her background is in mathematics and computer science, which she completed at the University of Konstanz. Sorry about the pronunciation. Much to her delight as an avid sport fan, part of her PhD project lies in the intersection of networks and sport, and her general research interest comprises methods and concepts for analyzing social networks. So let's give her a huge welcome, and and give you the floor so you can start sharing the screen. Thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me. So you can see the screen, right?
Yes, perfect.
Okay.
Yes, we see the whole
yes,
screen.
Yes. Sorry, there was the menu, which confused me. So thanks for the invitation. I'm happy to be here. And I want to present today two projects of my PhD, which relate to social influence dynamics and centrality in networks. So social influence is the process where individuals adopt their thoughts, feelings, behavior, or something not observable due to interactions with other individuals. And in our application case, this relates to coaching philosophies. So a coaching philosophy might consist of the way a coach is interacting with his players or how he's setting up the training, might be also related to tactics of the match. And there are various sources of influence that can impact the way a coach develops his coaching philosophy. It can be due to educational programs, seminars, workshops, which are more the formal, which are more from the formal side. But there's also a study which asks senior coaches of what has been very important to them during their coaching career. And what those senior coaches reported were that the own playing experiences under other coaches have been highly influential for them. And this is the aspect we want to focus on. So we assume that a coach is influencing his players with his way of coaching. So for example, more concretely, player Jock, so I think I forgot this, but we're talking about Australian rules football. So player Jock played in 1904 under Coach Bill and is in that season influenced by his way of coaching. The next two seasons, Jock plays under Coach Dick and is then influenced by his coaching philosophy. And what's very common in sports is that former elite players become coaches themselves at some point. So after some season, Jock becomes himself a coach and is now coaching other players and potential future coaches. And by that, he is kind of forwarding what he himself has learned under his coaches, Bill and Dick. But we also assume that during this process of coaching, Jock is kind of developing his own coaching philosophy, which he propagates to the players. And the question we were interested in is, based on this network of influence, who is the most influential coach in terms of who has the most influence on other coaches? And asking for the most influential coaches can be also considered as asking for central nodes in a network. So to give you a brief overview of the presentation, we're interested in the dyadic influence relationships between coaches. However, influence is not directly measurable. But what we can observe are these formal coaching relationships that we can assess with the network. And then we can kind of take these time-dependent dyadic influences, can transform them into another network that comprises all these seasonal influences in one indirect relation of influence. And what we get here is then a kind of an approximation of what we have been interested in. And based on this indirect relation, we can aggregate them and in that way find out about the most influential nodes. So as such, this kind of diffusion process and influence model can be also considered as a centrality index. And this will be the first part of the presentation. And the second part is more about centrality in directed networks. So centrality indices are applied to networks to provide a complete ranking of the importance of nodes. And very often it's simply a network is given. You select more or less randomly a centrality index where you think it's suitable, and then you get this ranking. However, the outcome, the ranking is very dependent on the choice of the index. And these centrality indices have a lot of implicit assumptions. And it has been proposed for undirected networks to consider the neighborhood inclusion as kind of a structural concept for centrality, which is taken as the base. And the idea of this is that a node that has at least the same neighbors as another node can't be less central. And these comparison of neighborhoods provide a partial ranking, which can be used as a bottom-up approach for making this ranking more and more complete and avoiding all these implicit assumptions and force you to, in every single step, to think about what it is you want to assume. So this has been done for undirected networks, and I will talk about how we can generalize this to directed networks. So coming back to the application case of the Australian football coaches, I want to talk about this model. So the idea is that players are getting influenced from their coaches, where influence is defined as, this influence process is defined as the process where individuals change their thoughts, feelings, attitudes, or behavior by interacting with other individuals or groups. And the extent to which the influence applies is on the one hand dependent on a dyadic weight that is dependent on the time, on the coach and the player, and on the other hand on a general parameter gamma. Opposed to influence is inertia, which has been found in the area of decision-making, that individuals often have this affinity to stick with the status quo, so to have some resistance to influence. And the weight with which the players stick to the current influence relationships is weighted according to this 1 minus gamma parameter. So this component applies to the players. And once a player becomes a coach, this allows, through the process of coaching, allows the coach to get rid of the received influences while during a player and becoming more independent again. where independence is defined as the freedom from the influence or control of other individuals or groups. And similar to the influence component, the extent to which independence applies is on the one hand dependent on an individual weight, and on the other hand on a general parameter 1 minus alpha. So how did we come up with these dyadic influence weights and the individual independence rates? There's a webpage, afltables.com, which has for every match since 1897 a list of the players and the associated coach. And we assume that for one season, the extent of influence from a coach to a player is described by the proportion of joint matches. So here, for example, player Alan Belcher played 2 out of his 4 matches in that season under coach Billy Strickland. So the dyadic influence weight would be 1/2. For the coaches, we set the rate of independence to be the proportion of coached matches relative to the matches of the associated club. So in the season 1904, Billy Strickland coached 6 out of the club's 18 matches. So the individual independence rate for Billy Strickland in the season would be 1/3. And in that way, this time-dependent network in the end consists of 365 nodes with in total 5,000 edges, of which around 3,500 are these dyadic influence edges and 1,600 independence rate. And the network spans more than a century from 1902 until the season of 2020. The idea is that the influence relationships of every coach and every node in the network is described by a distribution. And this distribution represents the proportion to which a node is influenced by another node. And we decided to start for every node with a distribution where for 90% we do not know how this distribution looks like, and 10% we give the node independence. And these distributions are here represented by this pie chart, where each node has this individual color representing the degree of independence. The 2 parameters of the model can have values between 0 and 1. And we chose them according to another study we found, which asked coaches for when in their coaching career, which kind of aspects have been very important for them. And they reported that especially in the beginning and in the middle period of their coaching career, these experiences as player have been very important. But they are less important when they are already more senior and more advanced. So we chose this independence parameter 1 minus alpha to be 0.1, such that on average, a coach would be completely independent after this middle period. And with the argument that this kind of playing under coach and coaching can be considered as 2 ways of learning, we set the influence parameter to the same value because we say this kind of learning progress is applying to the same degree. But we also made some robustness tests with values for the parameters between 0.02 and 0.2. And in the end, checked kind of what we got from the outcome. And there were high correlations. Of course, there are some differences, but it's not that everything is turned upside down. So now how is this influence, what is changing with the influence relationship of the coach? So here's one update example. In the season of 1904, player Jock and player Dick are playing under Bill. And the way the influence relationships of Jock, for example, are changing is a weighted average from the current state, from the relationships, and what is propagated from the relationships from the coach. Such that the new influence relationships from Jock is, this is the part from the old relationships, and then the extent to which the coach can propagate his influence relationships is dependent on the one hand of the dyadic weight and on the influence parameter. And the larger this weight, so the more Jock played the matches under Bill, and the larger this parameter, the more the coach could propagate his influence relationships. For the coach, we implemented the independence component as kind of decaying the current influence relationships with a factor smaller than 1, which is that part, and then filling up what has been released by this kind of compression with the independence. And very similar, the larger this individual weight and the larger this parameter, the faster a coach can become independent again from the received influences. And these updates are done for every season. And formally, they can be described as a recursive formula of adjacency matrices. So we have here in I of t, that's the row stochastic matrix, where each row describes the distribution of one node. So each row would be represented by one of these pie charts. In W are these dyadic influence weights, such that we have here the influence, we have here the inertia, and the weighted average of both multiplied with the current influence relationship describes then the influence propagation. If a node has coached in a given season, there will be a non-zero entry in this diagonal matrix E, such that for those nodes that have coached, this diagonal matrix is kind of decaying the current influence, and then here adding something on the diagonal and increasing the independence. The parameters, as I already said, are between 0 and 1. And you can start essentially with any row stochastic matrix of initial influence relationships. So doing these updates for every season, we end up for every node with a distribution, where you can see here, for example, that Jock is quite independent again after this time. And these distributions we can also kind of interpret as a network, where there is an edge from one node to the other node if a node is influenced with a specific weight. And this network we can aggregate, and we said, okay, we like the influence of one node is all the outgoing influence to other nodes. And this provides us then a ranking of the influential nodes. Now the result, here you can see the top 10 coaches, where we see that Jock is by far the most important coach From the second rank on, the centrality values are becoming much closer. And I'm aware that this name is probably telling you nothing, but Jock is a very famous person in Australian football. If we have a look at when these coaches started their coaching career, we see that Jock is one of the first ones, but we also see some people that are still alive or even like starting in the 80s, which is quite late compared to when we consider when this network starts. Interestingly, all of them are introduced in the Hall of Fame. They are all very successful coaches, so they have won multiple premierships. Many of them have been player coaches. Player coaches have been quite common in the earlier days. However, from around the 80s, that's not a concept anymore due to the professionalization of the sports. All of the coaches are also long-term coaches. They coached a lot of future coaches compared to the average overall coaches. And they also have very long coaching relationships to those future coaches. So to draw some intermediary conclusions, what we've seen from the model is that in the end, we get plausible results. The model gives us coaches that are in some sense extraordinary. But the coaches or the influence of the coaches is not simply dependent on one characteristic. It's not that the coach who started the first is the most influential one, or those with that one with the longest career, and so on. And this suggests that the influence value rather describes the overall position in this temporal network. I already said that we can also consider this process as kind of a centrality index. And we're also assuming implicitly some things. So first, of course, we assume that this indirect relation is describing influence relationships. We are summing them together. So we assume that influence is at least measured on an interval scale. We also assume by simply summing them up that all nodes are homogeneous, that it doesn't matter on whom you have influence. And all these implicit assumptions can be avoided through a bottom-up approach. And this approach looks at the local neighborhood of nodes in a network. And the idea is if J has at least the neighbors from I and might be even connected to I, then it can't be less central than I. And this kind of comparison gives us a partial ranking. So some nodes might be not comparable if they have different neighbors. And from this partial ranking, we can add the assumptions to make this ranking more complete, such that it is it's not simply dependent on the choice of centrality index. And this idea provides kind of a formal and structural conception of centrality in a network. So it has been proposed that a vertex index is a centrality if and only if it preserves the vicinal preorder. So this neighborhood inclusion is for undirected networks, and we want to generalize this for directed networks. However, this is not as straightforward because in directed networks, there are two types of neighborhoods. we have once the outgoing neighborhood and the incoming neighborhood. And we propose criteria based on either one type of neighborhood or some combination. And one is what has been previously only rather like conceptually proposed are like radial centralities, where it's more about reachability in a network, or medial centralities, which should more capture like being in the core or being in between of other nodes. So the idea behind this criterion is that a node is dominating another node if it has more relationships in one specific direction. This could be either the outwards, but you can also formulate this for the inwards neighborhood. So here J has at least the same neighbors as I, potentially some more, and it could be even have an outgoing edge to I. So this is only considering the outgoing neighborhood, but additionally we can also take into account the incoming neighborhood, as done here in the hierarchical criterion, where additionally to this more directions in more relationships in one direction, it's added that to have less relations in the other direction. So kind of depicting some kind of hierarchy where it's good to be the boss of multiple people and the node itself has only some people above. For the medial criterion, it's the idea to have more relationships in both directions. So for the outgoing, but also for the incoming neighborhoods. There are also some additional conditions, which are as follows. If there's an edge from I to J, the incoming neighbors of I needs to be in the outgoing neighborhood of J. And the idea is that if I have an edge to J, then kind of the in-betweenest position of I is gaining value, because every walk which would use this edge and end in J is increasing the importance of I. And to kind of compensate for that, if here is another edge from J to I, J also gains in this kind of betweenness for every walk that starts in I and uses this edge. For the radial and hierarchical criterion, it's quite easy to see that this gives a partial ranking, so that this neighborhood inclusion is reflexive and transitive. For the medial criterion, it's a bit more work. But what I also want to mention is that this kind of condition is not sufficient, and that we need these additional conditions to make this relationship transitive. So that's kind of the theory, but what can we do with that? So if we think about the coaches, for example, and have a look at the influence on others, we could say one node or one coach is more central or is dominating another coach if he has at least the same influence on at least the same coaches. And through this, we're looking at one direction of the neighborhood. Here you can see this kind of domination network where there is a directed edge from one node to another node if the upper node is dominating with respect to the outgoing influence on other coaches. Vertically, the coaches are ranked to the number of nodes they are dominating. So here we can see that Jock is dominating 170 other nodes in his influence relationships. And you might recognize here some names that you've seen before in the ranking. A new name is, for example, John Burrow, which is quite high in this domination ranking. However, he was not in the top 10 of the most influential nodes. That's different, for example, for Greg Hickey, who was the 10th most influential node. So why is he so low, but has been before like the top 10th node? And if we have a look at the influence on other nodes and have a look at the distribution, we see that here Greg Hickey has influence on some nodes, but the influence he has is rather large. So he has one node on which he has almost 50% influence. Compared to that, John Burrow has influence on a lot of nodes, but this influence rate is rather low. And these are things that we need to be aware of, whether this is what we would want to capture, whether it's better, or what we consider is to be more influential. Is it better to have more influence on less nodes, or is it better to have to reach more nodes, and all these things? And this can be kind of step by step made explicit through this bottom-up approach. There's also another application of these neighborhood criteria, which is that we can discriminate between centrality indices. So here are two centrality indices for directed networks. One is the harmonic closeness, which is the average inverse of the shortest distance to other nodes, and betweenness, which describes the share of being on shortest path between other nodes. And what you can show is that harmonic closeness is essentially a radial centrality measure. So whenever J has more outgoing neighbors than I, the harmonic closeness value of J will be larger than that of I. However, if we have an example here where J is medially dominating I because it has an additional incoming neighbor, this contradicts the closeness value of I, which is larger than that of J. Similarly, for the betweenness, we can come up with another example where J is dominating I with respect to the outgoing neighborhoods because it has an additional neighbor of H, but the betweenness value of I is strictly larger than that of J. On the other hand, you can show that if J is medially dominating I for betweenness, the centrality measure is preserving this relationship. And this kind of differentiation between centrality indices is not possible on undirected networks because these two concepts are merging. However, for the directed case, the criteria allow us to separate them, these different ideas of what it means to be central. There are also special graphs on which these kind of comparisons are total, so where every pair of nodes is comparable. And for all criteria, they are subsets of threshold digraphs. Threshold digraphs are a class of graphs which can be characterized as not having these kind of configurations where the solid edges are present and the dashed edges are forbidden. They have also more characterizations which are very similar to threshold graphs, kind of the undirected equivalent. And for the radial criterion, you can show that this kind of class of graphs where the criterion is, the comparison is total, corresponds exactly to interval orders, which go back to Norbert Wiener and Fishburne, and is a class that has been very well investigated. As a subclass of these, what we get from the hierarchical criterion are the semi-orders. But what we couldn't find so far in the literature as an already established class of graphs are these directed graphs where the medial criterion is total. And here you can also see that not every threshold graph is covered by these criteria. So maybe there are even more kind of concepts of centrality for the directed case, which are not covered yet and which might lie here. So to conclude for the second part, you have seen 3 formal neighborhood inclusion criteria for directed networks that yield partial rankings. And these can be used for a bottom-up approach to investigate the centrality of nodes only based on the structure of the network. We have also seen that there are different notions of centrality for directed networks, and that those networks on which the partial rankings are total are all subclasses of threshold digraphs, where this class, which is due to the medial criterion, is new. And it also raised the question of whether there might be additional notions of centrality in the directed case that are not covered yet. Yeah, so thanks for your attention. And I'm happy to answer your questions.
Thank you very much, Gordana. Everyone can use their reaction buttons, as always. And yeah, let's have a Q&A right now. So any kind of questions, comment, they are more than welcome. So please, you can unmute yourself, or I think you can also turn on your cameras. So feel free to do your questions in any way that it feels more comfortable.